US President Donald Trump lifted his own energy blockade of Cuba and allowed a Russian fuel tanker to pass through. The White House personally ordered the US Coast Guard not to touch the Russian tanker. Although back in January, Trump officially announced a complete blockade of Cuba and threatened that if any country tried to break the blockade and send oil to the Cuban authorities, that country would immediately face huge trade tariffs. But today, Trump unexpectedly stated, quote, "If any country wants to send oil to Cuba now, I have no problem with it, whether it's Russia or not." But the funniest thing is that Trump said he actually didn't impose a blockade on Cuba, that it just seemed that way to everyone. Also, according to Trump, Russian oil won't help Cuba because the communist government in Havana, in his opinion, will soon fall on its own. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, they boasted that while Trump was blocking oil supplies to Cuba for other countries, they personally made a deal with the American president for such deliveries. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, please subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and leave a comment below this video. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel and consider the information here important and necessary, you can do so with any donation or a paid subscription. If you're interested, watch the video and read the comments. And reflect with my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, the blockade of Cuba, which Trump announced in January, has officially ended without any result. The Russian tanker Anatoly Kolodkin, carrying a reported cargo of 100,000 tons of crude oil, arrived in Cuba today. It arrived and the US Coast Guard, which had stopped other ships heading to Cuba, didn't touch the Russians at all, since they received such an order directly from the White House. The Russian Ministry of Transport reported that, quote, "The Russian tanker Anatoly Kolodkin, carrying a humanitarian cargo of 100,000 tons of crude oil, arrived in Cuba. Currently, the vessel is waiting to be unloaded at the port of Matanzas." Later, the press secretary of the Russian dictator Dmitry Peskov said that the supply of Russian fuel to Cuba is vital for Havana and had been discussed with American colleagues in advance. Peskov also said that Moscow will continue working on delivering energy resources to Cuba. But an attentive viewer might immediately ask, didn't Donald Trump threaten everyone who dared to send oil to Cuba? Well, let me remind you of something. On January 29, 2026, US President Donald Trump declared a state of emergency due to the threat from Cuba. And he established a procedure for imposing tariffs on goods from countries that sell or otherwise supply oil to Havana. That or otherwise part is very important. That means it wasn't necessarily about selling oil. Any delivery of oil to Cuba immediately triggers sanctions. As Trump himself said at the time, quote, "The order was signed to protect the national security and foreign policy of the United States from the malicious actions and policies of the Cuban regime." In the official document, which by the way has not been revoked to this day and remains fully legally binding, it was stated that the United States is now required to impose additional tariffs on imports from any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. The same document stated that the Cuban regime, quote, "supports hostile forces and terrorism and creates regional instability that threatens the security and foreign policy of the United States." But a special place in this document was given to the information that, quote, "Cuba hosts Russia's largest overseas facility for collecting radio intelligence on the United States. As long as the regime keeps it, the United States will keep the blockade." In fact, after the United States seized President Nicolas Maduro in January, the island under communist rule stopped receiving oil from Venezuela, its main supplier. Later, supplies from other countries, such as Mexico, were stopped after the Trump administration threatened to impose additional tariffs on countries that supply oil. But just 2 months after the blockade was announced, Trump seemed like a completely different person. Today, on March 30, Trump suddenly announces that he doesn't mind if any country sends a shipment of oil to Cuba. He says, "Blockade? What blockade? There was no blockade at all." But that's not all. It turned out that the Russian tanker that arrived in Cuba today belongs to the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation and is under American sanctions. But Trump didn't notice that either. Trump doesn't see any of this today and says that he simply sympathizes with the Cuban people who are in dire need of energy resources and the blockade. So listen, Trump insists that it's no longer needed since the communist regime in Havana, according to his predictions, will soon fall on its own. He says we've already reached our goal. What blockade? Next I'll quote Trump. If any country wants to send oil right now, oil to Cuba, I have no problem with that. I prefer to let oil into Cuba, whether it's Russia or anyone else, because people need heating, cooling, and everything else they require. Cuba is doomed anyway. They have a bad regime, they have very bad and corrupt leadership, and whether they get an oil tanker or not, it doesn't make any difference. I prefer to let it through, whether it's Russia or anyone else. But here it's just one more question. So why declare a blockade of Cuba at all, and why did Trump, for example, previously threaten Mexico with tariffs when it tried to send oil tankers to Cuba, but now he's not threatening the Russians? Or as they say, that's different, don't you understand? In short, the Russians once again, blatantly spat right in Trump's face. He wiped it off and pretended nothing happened. He says, "What blockade? Why are you bothering me about this?" They started asking him about this on Air Force One, and he got really nervous. He was like, "What blockade? Who even blocked Cuba? That never happened." Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence reports that Russia has recruited about 15,000 Cubans to fight in the war against Ukraine. And oil is kind of a payment to the communists for manpower. Meanwhile, Trump himself is playing dumb, and when journalists on board the presidential plane pointed out that the decision to allow the Russian tanker from the Shadow Fleet to pass helps President Vladimir Putin of Russia, Trump replied, quote, "Putin is losing just one shipment of oil and that's it. If he wants that, if other countries want that, it doesn't really bother me." I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Petchy News. The link is in the description. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so by donating or getting a paid subscription using the links and details in the video description or by scanning the QR code on your screen. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.